There are hundreds of basic and alternate recipes in Satisfactory 1.0. Some of them are absolutely amazing, whilst others not so much. So I've made it my mission in Satisfactory to compare every single recipe in the game to inform you guys on what the best and worst recipes are. So welcome to the best recipes in Satisfactory 1.0 series. Today's video is all about the nuclear pasta, one of the most important items in the entire game. You can produce your nuclear pasta right here in the particle accelerator, which is unlocked in tier 8 of the hub. Now at first glance, the nuclear pasta recipe actually looks really simple. You only need copper powder and pressure conversion cubes. But despite not being as large as other space elevator parts, and yes, I'm most certainly talking about this devilish item right here, it is still fairly big. But not only is the nuclear pasta used for phase 4 and phase 5 of the space elevator, but is also used down here as well to do the singularity cells. These cells are extremely important, especially when you are trying to make your Fixonium fuel rod, and it is also used here in the ballistic warp drive. So in theory, you technically actually need your nuclear pasta for 3 different stages of the space elevator, for phase 4, for phase 5, and again to help you there with that ballistic warp drive. So that's the brief on the nuclear pasta, but now let's get into the best recipe in my opinion, and bear in mind there are thousands of different combinations you can use here. This is just my preferred one. Today we're making 10 nuclear pasta per minute. For that we are going to need 10 pressure conversion cubes and 2000 copper powder, and I suppose this is where we'll begin because these numbers by themselves are rather crazy. If you've ever had to make copper powder for nuclear pasta before, you know this can get quite intense. So to make our 2000 copper powder, we are going to need 12,000 copper ingots, which is an insane amount. If you didn't use this alternate recipe called pure copper ingots, that would then mean that you are going to need 12,000 copper ore. But luckily, because I'm using pure copper ingots, I only need 4,550 copper ore and 3,200 water, which as we can see right now is roughly 27 water extractors just to make our copper ingots. What if you really did not want to use refineries and instead you wanted to opt in for the smelter method? Well, don't worry, because that's completely fine as well, because we know that to make our 12,000 copper ingots we need 12,000 copper ore. Each smelter can take in 30 copper ore at a time. We have to do 12,000 divided by 30, meaning that you are going to have to use 400 smelters just to make your copper ingots. And then of course you then turn that into copper powder from your constructors. And one constructor can make 50 copper powder per minute, and we need 2,000. So again, 2,000 divided by 50, meaning that you're going to need an extra 40 constructors. So yep, do not worry if you don't want to have to use refineries, you probably end up saving a lot of power there anyway, but I like to try and save like 8,000 or 7,450 copper ore per minute, so I'm going to opt for this strategy. However, now let's move over to the main bulk of the recipe itself, which is the pressure conversion cube. And for this, we're just, again, going to need 2 items. The first of which being our 20 radio control units, and our second being our 10 fused modular frames. This is where we're going to start off. The raw resources that we are consuming here is limestone, iron, bauxite, crude oil, and copper, as well as nitrogen gas and water, of course. So we're going to need 250 nitrogen gas here, which might sound like a lot, but bear in mind you are making 10 nuclear pasta per minute, so it's quite a small compromise in reality. However, we also need 500 aluminium casings. Now, again, regular viewers of the channel know that I talk about aluminium a lot, so I'm very quickly going to go over it. Most important thing to note about this recipe in particular is that I'm using something called alclad casing, which means I save on some aluminium but get some copper involved with the recipe instead. I've also gone for something called sloppy solution, which means I don't have to make silica as a byproduct, and I'm using petroleum coke here as well because I've got tons of petroleum coke in my playthrough, but you can always use coal if you so wish. You're also producing 468 water as a byproduct, which is fantastic, and 44.5 polymer resin as a byproduct from the heavy ore residue, which isn't too bad either. And that's essentially our aluminium recipe done. Moving on to one of my personal favorite recipes in the entirety of Satisfactory, the heavy modular frame. But why do I like this recipe so much? Because I'm only using 2 raw resources, limestone and iron, which makes producing this so extremely simple it's almost laughable. Starting with our concrete, I'm using an alternate recipe called wet concrete, which is found in the refinery. This essentially consumes less limestone to make your concrete, but you do have to use water. Moving on to our steel pipe recipe, I'm using something called iron pipe, which, as you can see, just involves iron. Now, it does require quite a lot of iron, but I still feel like the ratio is pretty good and 0 coal is being used. Moving on again now to our encased industrial beam, where, as you may have noticed, we are using the exact same items that I've just shown over here: concrete, steel pipe, concrete, steel pipe. I 1000% that you recommend the encased industrial pipe alternate recipe for the encased industrial beam. And then lastly, we've got the modular frame, where again, the only raw resource we are consuming other than water is iron, because our reinforced iron plates require iron plates, which, believe it or not, requires iron ingots. Wire, which when using our iron wire recipe just requires iron, and then steel pipe, which when using our iron pipe recipe again only requires iron. This is a very classic example of making my life easier with very basic logistics. This is very simple to produce, I've already produced it and I do recommend it, but of course adding water is optional. And that's our 10 fused modular frames. Now onto our 20 radio control units, where the first thing that we are going to need is our 80 heat sinks, and this is the recipe that I've got laid out. Again, I think it's pretty good. I'm not going to go over the aluminium side of things, but for the copper sheet, I will very quickly explain what I've done here. Essentially, what I've done is use something called steamed copper sheet, which saves me a bunch of copper ingots but uses some water. I've then used pure copper ingots, which again saves me on some extra copper, which is fantastic. I'm probably saving hundreds of copper ore per minute by using this recipe, which is great when you're trying to save on resources. The second item that we need for our 20 radio control units is 40 high-speed connectors. And again, this recipe is extremely simple. The copper sheet recipe that I just showed, plus a little bit of silica to make your circuit boards. This way I'm using 0 crude oil per minute, which I like, but you may not do. That's completely fine. I just find this rather simple to do logistically. We are then going to need 2,240 quickwire, which sounds like a lot, and I suppose because it is, but luckily we are only needing 188 caterium or 375 caterium ore, because I'm using a couple alternate recipes, which again gets copper involved, but ends up saving me tons of caterium ore. In fact, let's do the maths. How much caterium ore do I need to make 2,240 quickwire without using pure caterium ingots and the copper alternate recipe? Well, when we times everything here by 100, we see that we need 448 caterium ingots. And again, times everything here by 100, and that means that we are going to need 1,344 caterium ore. Now compare that to the 375 that I'm actually using. That is why I love this quickwire recipe. I know I keep talking about it in these videos, but in case you haven't seen one of those previous videos that I've made about the best recipes, I keep highlighting it because I genuinely think this recipe is rather good. And then again, for our 40 high-speed connectors, we're going to need 400 cable. I'm again using my iron wire, which means I'm only consuming 250 iron ore to make my 400 cable, which is not too bad. Now, the very final thing that we are going to need here to make our 20 radio control units, and the final part of today's recipe breakdown, is our 250 quartz crystal. I'm using something called pure quartz crystal, which essentially means I save a bunch of quartz, but I have to get water involved with the recipe, which I don't necessarily mind, because raw quartz is a rather difficult item to try and find in your world. And that concludes today's recipe, but we are not done there just yet, because how many raw resources are you consuming, how many machines are you using, and how much power is required to make your 10 nuclear pasta per minute? Now let's find that out. Starting with our raw resources, and we are going to need 6,568 water per minute, 5,252 copper, 1,154.5 iron, don't forget about that 0.5, 109.5 crude oil, 365 limestone, 1,055 bauxite, 250 nitrogen gas, 365 raw quartz, and 375 caterium. Now, what are the main concerns with the resources here? Well, firstly, 6,568 water per minute is quite a lot, but most of that is due to our copper powder and copper ingot recipe, which is fine. And again, 5,000 copper ore is quite a lot, but that's all to do with the copper powder. This again would have been somewhere near 13,000 if I didn't do the pure copper ingot recipe or trick, whatever you like to call it. That's not too bad. None of this is really too bad. 1,000 bauxite's quite a lot, but not really too much you can do about that, because you do need quite a lot of aluminium for this. And the only other concern really is a little bit of caterium and a little bit of raw quartz. that amount of nitrogen gas shouldn't be too much of a concern, but overall, raw resource-wise, really good. I'm actually quite happy with this. However, the same cannot be said when it comes to our machines required, and that's because of our particle accelerator, where we are going to need 20 of these things, and the average megawatt consumption is going to be 20,000 megawatts, with the maximum at being 30,000. So there's one recipe alone, you're consuming a maximum of 30,000 megawatts worth of power, and I haven't even gotten to anything else just yet. But let's just ignore that for now, because we're also going to need 7 blenders consuming 500 megawatts, 21 manufacturers consuming 1,081 megawatts, 75 refineries consuming 5,637 megawatts, 91 assemblers consuming 1,308 megawatts, 147 constructors consuming 678. I was surprised about that myself, but yes, it is that much. 14 smelters consuming 56 megawatts, but for our 55 water extractors, you're going to have to consume 1,100 megawatts worth of power. So let's add up everything here and let's assess the damage. So in total, to make your 10 nuclear pasta per minute, you are going to be consuming 40,360 megawatts worth of power. Now that might sound like a lot, and honestly, that's because it is. But also bear in mind, you are making 10 nuclear pasta per minute, which is quite a lot in all honesty. For example, 10 singularity cells require just 1 nuclear pasta. And when it comes to the ballistic warp drive, the biggest thorn in my backside, you need 5 singularity cells to make 1 ballistic warp drive, which essentially means that you are going to be consuming 0.5 nuclear pasta to make 1 ballistic warp drive, which when you put it like that, it doesn't actually sound too bad. And then when it comes to Fixonium, it's a 1-to-1 ratio with a singularity cell, which essentially means that you'll be consuming 0.1 nuclear pasta to make your 1 Fixonium, which again isn't too bad. So you could probably end up making your nuclear pasta go quite a long way, but regardless, do let me know in the comments down below what other space elevator part would you like me to cover. Thank you very much for watching, liking and subscribing. I hope to see you in the next video, and Godspeed.